The topic chosen for today, I must say, is not an easy one. And that's simply because there is such a wealth of information that we are bombarded with day in and day out through a great variety of media. And it is therefore very difficult to do justice to all that in the short space of 3/4 hour. And inevitably, there will be areas that I will miss, there will be areas that I will not be able to go into as much as would be appropriate. And I hope that you take these points up then at the time of questioning. And maybe there is an opportunity to look at it with a little bit more depth. All I am trying to achieve at this moment is to present to you general trends that can be observed in the media and see if there is a pattern, see if there is a reason for that pattern, who is behind it, and finally, what can we do about it? Because if, as I from the outset suggest, we are not happy with the status quo, then of course we must attempt to do something about it. And there may be certain ways where we can, and there may be other circumstances that possibly stop us from that. The media, of course, divides into the print media, and I leave books aside for a moment because that's an entirely different category again, which I don't think I should be able to deal with right now. Even so, a short remark about that. I did participate many years back in the research into the presentation of Islam in German school books. And school books in Germany are approved by the government. You cannot use in the school just any book you like. And therefore there was a case because the government instructions were that any particular religion, any faith, ought to be represented in such a way that an adherent to that faith could recognize himself in that very description. We had a research institute looking at whether that was actually happening, whether that was the case. And the first thing we found to our surprise is that Islam crops up in the most unlikely places. Not just in history books, not just maybe in geography, but even in books about music, in books about all kinds of subject matter. And we found that generally, with the exception of books on religion, where there was an attempt to represent the faith fairly to some degree, the representation in the other books was generally stereotyping of a negative kind. So books also, particularly school books, warrant to look into. It'd be nice to repeat something like this in this country, even so the books are not state approved and there are a great variety of books around, but it'd be nice to do that because it is from that early age that people get a perception of the other faith. It is from that early age that they repetitively take in certain so-called facts. And when a journalist writes an article about something he doesn't know anything about, subconsciously he digs back into that past and thinks, oh yes, that were those people, the Saracens, the Turks, the barbarians, who were led by this shepherd who said he had a new Bible. Yeah? All these sort of stereotypes come across when you read these books. They're not always explicit, they're sometimes very subtle. Of course, you will find general assumption also in all kinds of books that are not related to school. And again, I would say look at the books that don't deal with the subject Islam and see what they have to say about it. Look at novels. I've read a very interesting novel that created a kind of false Muslim leader who was going to present to them some kind of uprising and rebellion, which would then enable his paymasters to control that uprising and rebellion and make it go their way without people suspecting it. Very interesting. It was just a spy story, really, one of these action novels. But it's interesting because that is the other thing that we must look at, that of course people sometimes dream out what later becomes reality. And I get back to that when I talk about films. People sometimes project things before they actually do them. Many great novels in our modern age are the byproduct of people's real experiences. George Orwell's 1984, and of course we are in 1999 now, and a lot of it has actually become true, and other things have not become true in the same way. Certainly the double-speak works very well in the news media. Another topic I hope to touch upon. But it was based on his own work in the Secret Service. And so, of course, he had knowledge of certain things that were going to happen, and so some of it he put into his novel. Just like Douglas Hurd, late Foreign Secretary, used to write crime stories and novels that very often had features in there that were based on his political experience. But I said I'll leave books aside because it's a very deep subject, and we wouldn't get very far if we concentrated on that. And so when I talk about print media, I will deal with magazines and newspapers. And then there is radio and television, which is a different category we need to look at. And then there is the film industry. What I would say from the very beginning is that Muslims, A, are underrepresented in all these media. Underrepresented in many ways. Firstly, because they do not have their own widely circulated print media, radio stations, TV stations, or filmmakers, film studios. Now, you might say, well, that is hardly surprising because there are only about, well, we don't have even exact figures, unfortunately, but there are only about between 1 and 2 million Muslims in this country, which means something like 3% of the overall population, maybe. We don't have a question about religious affiliation in the census, so we do not really know. We extrapolate from ethnic figures, and we hope that the next census will correct that, because if you don't even know what you're dealing with, it's very difficult to actually establish patterns belonging to those minorities and find remedies for it. You could say that with 3% of the population, it's hardly surprising that they do not have these kind of organs at their disposal, and that they do not have that wide circulation that other media have. But then I must contrast that with the Jewish community in this country, who are only about 1/3 of the size of the Muslim community, if not less, but have great influence over those media. A reading of the names of the editors of our major broadsheets, as well as tabloids, reveals that there is a predominance of people belonging to the Jewish faith. And I'm not attacking them for it, I'm simply mentioning that this is the fact. Newscasters, editors at radio stations, filmmakers, film production companies like Warner Brothers and so on, owners of newspapers like the late Robert Maxwell or Rupert Murdoch, very powerful people belonging to that tiny minority that is much smaller than that minority of Muslims. And that is an interesting situation, because without wanting to go into how it has come about, and if somebody wants to get a little bit deeper into that, I recommend, and that's why I put one aside, that you buy and read this particular book by David Pidcock, the Islamic Party leader, called Satanic Voices, Ancient and Modern, initially written in response to the Rushdie satanic verses, but looking a little bit more deeply into why religion, and particularly Islam, has come under attack and what is achieved by it. So I'm not wanting to look into the causes, how did this get about, but what I'm saying is that when people like this are in certain positions, there is a great chance that they will favor people of their own belonging over people of another belonging. So when it comes to the film industry, I shall say a little bit more about that a little bit later. So it is quite natural that you have maybe 4 out of 5 guests at Sue Lawley's Desert Island Disc of a Jewish background. And you wonder, how relevant is that to a predominantly Christian secular country? Are there no great personalities of other faiths that could equally make it onto that program? Are there no Muslims that could make it onto that program? Because there has never been one. This raises questions. Then there is, of course, another lever of influence upon the media, and that is advertising. Who pays the money pulls the strings. I learned that very early on in my own career as a journalist, that you must not upset your advertisers. If you upset your advertisers, they will withdraw their advertising. And that can have some hefty consequences for your paper or your magazine. And therefore you will tread very carefully in what you say and what you don't say. Now, I would also say that the largest advertisers these days are the banks and other financial institutions. And we might look into what do they support by way of a policy and what do they not support by way of a policy. What may you say and what may you not say? We as the Islamic Party, for example, did not make it very often into the media. Initially, it went round the world like a big bang that there was such a thing as an Islamic Party in this country, as a novelty, as a challenge. But eventually, when people realized what we stood for and that we were predominantly campaigning for a reform of or change to the interest-based finance and monetary system, that we wanted to withdraw from banks the rights to create credit based on nothing, to issue credit through fractional reserve banking. In other words, to lend more than they have, or to lend what they have not got and then charge interest for it. It was very quickly that we were silenced and do not make it onto the programs very often, because it is those very banks that would then be offended. So let's look at what is coming across the contents of these media. Let's take the newspapers and the magazines. Of course, I am not pretending that we Muslims are the only one who get a rough deal out of the media. That is certainly not true. Other people will also rightly say that whenever something is written about us, it doesn't quite reflect what we feel, it doesn't quite reflect the truth. Journalism has become interested in half-truths and sensational stories. It does not make good news that you have a story like Muslim lived peacefully with Christian neighbor for 20 years. You won't find that in the papers because it's not newsworthy. But you will find it in the papers if there is troubles. So you will find stories like we have the festival of Eid al-Adha coming up again after the Hajj season, and there is the ritual sacrificing of sheep. You will find horror stories about how brutally and barbaric these Muslims slaughter their sheep in large numbers. That you find across the country at that time. Lately, very rarely have we got some stories about what the festival stands for, and that this sacrifice is a reenactment of the sacrifice of Abraham, where he was ransomed by sacrificing a sheep instead of his own son. Which, if it was put across, would give people an understanding that there are actual common origins, that there are common stories, that there is common ground between these religions. But if you simply point a finger and say, Muslims slaughter sheep in open sight, with no hygiene. I remember one newspaper editor of a local paper, and I must say that local papers are a little bit more approachable because they're not as tightly controlled. Phoned me about a story like this, and then eventually dropped the whole story, which is better than printing a bad story, so he could have done something better instead. When I told him that the reason that Muslims go to backyards and farms and slaughter deer is because they do not have the same access to slaughterhouses. That their slaughter is not generally permitted, is not generally practiced in slaughterhouses. And that by denying them to use the facilities that are available, they are forced to do things somewhere around the corner. And that the farmers cash in very well on that business by buying in cheap sheep from Eastern Europe and flocking them off at high prices. And that Muslims here, rather than being perpetrators, are the victims of this trade. But these are typical stories that make it into the papers. And that is respectable papers. I'm not talking just about papers like The Sport or The Sun, where you could get headlines like Muslim ate my hamster. I mean, those things are gone now generally. We have a little bit, things have improved to some degree. When all newscasters at the beginning of Ramadan, because of the bombing of Iraq, talk about Ramadan, well, there is one improvement, they can pronounce it now. They couldn't 20 years ago, so things have moved on, I must say. And so many other words they can pronounce now. And there is a greater awareness of Muslims amongst us, to the degree that government needs to somehow justify their action and try not to upset too much their own Muslim population. Not that I think Muslims are that easily fooled. It doesn't matter whether it is Ramadan or whether it is not Ramadan. When you bombard and kill innocent men, women and children on a pretext, when you starve them of essential food items, when you create cholera and other diseases by denying them even the chlorine to put in the water supply because this is part of the prohibited articles that may not be exported to Iraq, when you are subtly creating a genocide and then report about it in very scientific, surgical language of taking out targets, or personalizing it as if you're hitting one Saddam Hussein and never mind the thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of children that have died, whilst he is still there playing the game with them, then Muslims don't care is it Ramadan or not. But it is interesting that even at times like this, Islam comes into play. You will find that news reporters like Mr. Simpson will usually report standing in front of a mosque, as if here we have a war with Islam. And you will find that if a day or two after you walk the markets with your family, that you will hear abuse, that you will call Saddam, that our women wearing headscarves will be insulted and spat at. Because these kinds of reports, these kinds of misrepresentations of a faith create a certain level of hysteria that ordinary people who are not necessarily the intellectual type respond to, act upon. And you will find that the number of attacks goes up after such irresponsible reporting. And it is now recognized since the Runnymede report that there is not just a thing like racism, but there is also such a thing like Islamophobia, as they call it. Horrible name, but for want of a better name, that there is a prejudicial fear of Islam as a terrorist, backwards, middle-aged, not middle-aged like, well, I'm getting there, but I mean the Dark Ages as they call them. There was only the European Dark Ages because at that time Islam was flourishing. And it was Islam that brought Europe out of the Dark Ages and brought us the so-called Age of Enlightenment. And little credit do we give the Muslims in Andalusia, in Spain, for all the scientific discoveries that we took of them, and then people put their own names under it. So of course twisted it as well in the sense that Islamic science was science for the purpose of finding out more about God, of harmonizing our relationship with Him, whereas Western secular science was a way of denying, fighting God, becoming independent from Him, and becoming gods ourselves. Now, one of the techniques used in the media, as I said, is stereotyping. But another technique is that Orwellian doublespeak. Where you don't call things by their proper name. So in a wartime situation, collateral damage doesn't sound all too bad, does it? Certainly not as bad as telling you that they hit a bridge and that bridge was actually hit during rush hour traffic. And well, you try London Bridge or Severn Bridge or something in rush hour traffic. What happens if a bomb falls on it? But you will not think about that because it's only called collateral damage. Nice, clean word. Doesn't get you thinking twice. Or have you ever wondered why only 40% of their precision bombs reach their targets? An interesting twist of the word precision. Because 60% obviously did not reach their target. And where did they go? And why did they go there if they're so precise? Or was that maybe the intended target that they should go astray? So terminology is one way of doing it. Subtleties are another. Like the connections that you draw. And the connections that you leave out. There's a big difference if you say, in a simple three-line report, today, police caught a Muslim thief. And then you find somewhere else a report that today police caught a middle-aged rapist. What's that to do with each other? You see, when the man is not a Muslim, you hardly find his religion mentioned. How often do you get crime reports in the papers that say the Christian rapist, the Jewish thief, the Catholic murderer? I challenge you, look them up, they're not there. But you will find them with the prefix Muslim. And the question is Muslim a race or is it a religion? You can look at me straight, it is not a race. You can look around, it is not a race. So very often things are said by what is not mentioned. And of course, lies are not always grand lies. It was one newspaper editor who said that for a lie to succeed, it must contain an element of truth. The question, how much space is given to the truth and how much space is given to the lie? You remember the Oklahoma bombing? It was Muslim terrorists. Remember? It must have been. It couldn't be anybody else. In all the newspaper headlines, it was Muslim terrorists. Meanwhile, non-Muslim Americans have been arrested, charged, tried, found guilty. But you look for the same newspapers, the bold headlines with the apology. Sorry, we got it wrong. You won't find it. You look anywhere for a retraction that it wasn't the Muslims. And you see whether the fact that they found that it was somebody else got as much visible presence in the media as the initial headlines, and you will find it didn't. Another technique, I already said that they dream out things and do them later, is to shock. And then slowly people get used to an idea. So certain things will be shown very often purposefully. I remember there was a television discussion this Islam hater Mr. Kilroy took part. I say that because he openly in the papers and in other places has made very derogatory statements about Islam. And there they were presenting from Jerusalem. There was the Dome of the Rock in the background. And there they were saying, if it wouldn't be a good idea if that building was moved to another country, then the Muslims could have their dome and we could build our temple. Due to the vigilance of Muslims in Palestine, that hasn't quite happened yet, so lots of things have happened. They have tunnels under Masjid al-Aqsa, under all kinds of archaeological and other pretenses, weakening the foundations. They have denied people access if they don't live in Jerusalem, so people from the West Bank and so on, to pray there, trying to sever the mosque from the people. Lately we had an advertisement on London Underground by El Al and the Israeli tourist board with the Dome of the Rock and then the Sea of Galilee, and talking about the millennium. The dome has already been built. Whose dome is it? Because advertising is also a form of media and media propaganda. Advertising is an interesting one, because in advertising you find it all the time, and that doesn't just affect Muslims. I must say that again. The gently, step by step, the taste of people is moved from one position to another, where there is some social and political engineering through advertising. Where if you showed advertising pictures of today to people 20 years ago, they'd go berserk. But we have gradually got used to this type of pictures, where people gently suggest to you, just look at this whole thing about selling and growing of body parts and genetic modifications and genetic engineering and so on. How it has been a constant method of presenting us with something outrageous, getting us horrified, getting us worked up, then talking so much about it until our senses are numbed and we gradually succumb to it and find nothing wrong with it anymore, because you can only be shocked that often. And after a while, you are desensitized, and it doesn't shock anymore. And then they can just do it, and you won't protest. GM food, same thing. Big reporting about GM food now, after they tell you that it's everywhere, and you can't do anything about it. Now let's discuss whether it's good or not. That's helpful, isn't it? So again, I mean, that's not just something affecting Muslims, but there is this timing of when something is put across, this what is repeated a lot and what is left out. Now if you listen carefully, I am almost suggesting that there is a higher agenda. That media, even if they're called the independent, are not independent. Because you see, a very simple calculation will make you understand about how dependent or independent newspapers and magazines and radio stations and TV stations really are. Where did they get their news from? It is only a few very larger ones that have their own correspondents in different countries. The majority get their news from the news services. And there aren't that many news services around. They are concentrated in a very few hands. These news services will provide them with information from which the different papers take and leave and give a different angle and shades of red and blue and green. But they all take it from that. Now, news services, like Reuters, for example, reduce the volume of news that goes in immensely, so that only 5% of what they receive in news information is passed on their wires, as that pool from which The media that we know take it. Now that 5% is selected based on what? Who prioritizes and why? It is therefore not surprising that our news is Eurocentric or American-centered as well. That our news does not treat countries in the West on an equal footing with countries in the East. When you see those films of slums in Africa, or Calcutta, or wherever, I say to you, I could make the same kind of film in London, but it is not done. We have the same kind of crime, poverty, people sleeping in the streets. Here in the West, go to New York and film the rats. But we portray our city centers with big buildings, nice, shiny, glossy facades, people with suits. You can find people with suits in Calcutta. You can find big buildings in Africa. What do we focus on? How do we contrast? So there is a selectiveness. And in that selectiveness there are assumptions. And these assumptions are based on the same prejudices that produce the kind of school books I mentioned at the very beginning. Let me move on, however. Into the arena of film. The majority of films are produced by Hollywood. Hollywood is they have lost perspective of all other crimes. You will find that every single week there should be at least 1 or 2 films on the main terrestrial channels dealing with the Third Reich, dealing with the Holocaust, dealing with the Germans way 50 years back. How many films are there about Vietnam, about Korea, about Cambodia, about Iraq? I'm not saying they don't exist, but we don't get to see them every week twice. Are you trying to tell me that not as many people died in Russia? That the suffering of one people is unique over all others? That the maiming of children in Bosnia does not matter, and that's why we don't need to be shown films about it? If the idea was to say, never again, why is it happening all around us and we close our eyes and watch another Holocaust film? Where we can be self-righteous and say, we are not like that. We saved them. We went to war to stop that. No, we didn't. Germans suffered, British people suffered, French people suffered. For what? British bombers did not bomb the factories, the armament factories of Tyson. They bombed Dresden. Civilians. Because they had shares in Tyson. They were making money out of the arms that the Germans were producing. And so Lord Tyson now is in England. Montague Norman, the then governor of the Bank of England, who was related to the financier of Hitler through marriage, raised substantial sums of money to bring Hitler to power, knowing well that they would never be paid back. He was not tried for treason. He was elevated to a peership. Because bankers know that war is good for business. And they earn from both sides. So when bankers run our society, we're in deep trouble. Because all they look at is balance sheets. They don't look at human suffering. We've just had comic relief. Wonderful, big show, charity. I would suggest it kills a lot of small charities that everything's big now. That controls it as well. The lottery, comic relief. But be that as it may, has it raised a lot of money to send to where? The poor countries. That's marvelous. But if you look that these poor countries are compelled to pay multiples of the money they receive in aid in interest payments back to the West, we're just perpetuating the problem. We're just having a laugh at their expense. And this is why we support, for example, campaigns like Jubilee 2000. People who want a total debt cancellation for the new millennium. But even so, people like Muhammad Ali and others stood behind that campaign and lent their name to it. It only made it onto the news as an add-on. And you don't hear about it anymore because it is not the agenda that these media want to push. Because I said earlier, you must not upset your advertisers. One more problem, and then I must close and deal with some of the possible steps we can take. One more problem is the way news are presented. Because if you can switch in a television news program, which is becoming more and more infotainment, between an item about war somewhere, an item about a crime somewhere else, a rugby match, and the weather, then essentially you are stopped from responding to whatever horrible things you see, because it's just there on the screen, and 5 minutes later it is gone, and we're back to entertaining nice, false, fake programs to keep our minds off what we have just witnessed. And so we do not see peace movements now anymore as we did at the time of the Vietnam War. Also because we are not told the true facts anymore. They come out in leaks years and years later. Who is telling you, for example, about the depleted uranium in Iraq? Who is telling you, and it only appeared in an article in The Guardian, and why? Because about 60% of babies born to the wives of war veterans had deformities. Because our people started suffering, we talk about it. We don't talk about the children in Iraq that are born without heads, that are born with 3 arms, about the crop that grows there, the tomatoes that are 5 times oversized. We don't talk about it. Because these smart weapons using depleted uranium, cutting through steel and leaving an atomic nightmare behind. We don't talk about it. It's not our problem. It doesn't make it into the news. It only makes it into the news if our own people suffer. Contrast the story of the Saudi nurse, the nurse caught in Saudi Arabia on fraud charges and now convicted by a sheriff court in Scotland of similar charges, with the story of the Muslims put on trial for alleged terrorist charges in the Yemen. Dig out the papers, compare. In one case, it was our British nurse suffering injustice at the hands of a corrupt Saudi legal system. Whereas there it is potential Muslim terrorists being dealt with. In this case, why not so corrupt legal system? Because it serves our purposes. There was the insinuation that the nurse had to confess because she was threatened with torture. Here are the allegations that they actually have been tortured and proof of it, and even the solicitor for them has been beaten up. But we don't get outraged about that, because there are different types of citizens. And a British Muslim is just not the same as a British, full stop. He's only tolerated, he's only here by accident, he doesn't quite belong. We still have the divide, we still have the crusade mentality, we still have the we and them. It has not changed that much. But back to, yes, when you have these news flashes coming all over the place, what it does to you, it makes you kind of slump in your seat and either get frustrated or flick over. But it is not designed to make you get up, get together with other people and do something about it. To the contrary, you're not meant to talk to people anymore. You're not meant to organize anymore. You're not meant to form solidarity committees. You're meant to just take it as it is. And so if we want to change it, we must get out of that precise mentality. We must get up, pick up the phone, pick up the pen and write letters, irrespective of whether they get published or do not get published. Because one thing I haven't mentioned, and that is that media are of course written by real people, managed by real people. Now, if they write a story against Muslims and nobody complains, then they don't think they've done anything wrong. But if they wrote the same story against Jews, heaven would fall down, and so they won't do it a second time. Well, we must make heaven fall down on them if they do it against Muslims. But that will only happen if each and every one of us feel responsible, that when we encounter something that is not right, we say so. We get up and write and phone and register our complaint. And even if that will not be published, it may well be that this editor, when he gets his 20, 30, 100, 5,000 letters, whatever, thinks, well, next time I'll tread carefully there. This is the only way you can influence the media as a consumer. Besides that, of course, it is necessary that we create and support our own media, difficult as that may be. And that we have people who train to understand how the media work, how to produce the media, how to circulate. There is no good in having a paper and nobody reads it. We must market it in the same way. There is no good, let's say, to have a tape of a talk and nobody hears it. So we must reach an audience. We must begin to network. We must start to help each other out. So that if somebody notices something wrong, he doesn't just respond himself, but he gets another 20 people to do so, who get another 20 people to do so too. And this is how it multiplies. We must stand up and be counted. We must feel responsible. We must not always just complain about how unfairly we are treated. We must take matters into our own hands. We will not get fair treatment just by praying for it. We must study, observe, respond. Because I must admit that very often people, when they portray us wrongly, don't even know that they've done anything wrong. Don't even realize that they might have hurt our feelings. Don't even notice until you point it out to them that this is an assumption, this is a stereotype. So we must also educate them. And the media won't do it for us. So we have to create our own ways of communication. I think I have to stop there. I've overrun already a little bit. Sadly, yes, I have only been able to touch upon a number of features, aspects, left, right, and center of this topic. I hope it has at least helped to get you thinking and maybe inspire some response. And if there is anything else you want to take up particularly now, I think there is still some opportunity to do so. Thank you very much.